If the moral of the story is help others, why do you need a parable to say that? Aside from the fact that you could just say that, help other people, be nice. Jews already had help others written into their sacred texts. There were plenty of policies and procedures, rules and guidelines built around helping your neighbor. And we don't even need it to be in sacred text to know that it's the right thing to do. Heck, State Farm Insurance has their jingle, right? Like a good neighbor, State Farm, hey, they get it. They get it. And if they've got your back, why bother with a parable from Jesus to tell you the same thing? The story that comes from Jesus is formulaic, as so many of his stories are. Every Jew in the first century knew the way in which these stories were told, as we do in the 21st century. We say, Larry, Mo, and you fill in the blank. In the church, we might say, Father, Son, and Holy, and you fill in the blank. Jesus takes traditional formulas and then he alters them for his own purposes. The parable of the prodigal son is the same kind of thing. A father had two sons. Every Jewish person in the first century knows that kind of story. That kind of story means that two brothers will have argument with each other. They'll go off their own ways, and then eventually they'll reconcile and live happily ever after. And Jesus tells that story, except he changes it so that the two brothers don't kiss and make up at the end. A truly memorable story. And so now a Levite and a priest go down the road, and in everyone's understanding in the first century, they would have heard a Levite and a priest, and they would have filled in the blank with Israelite. A Levite and a priest and an Israelite. Those three always went together because that's how you describe Jewish people in the Holy Land at that time. You were pretty much one of the three, a priest, a Levite, or an Israelite. And Jesus says, a Samaritan. What? Father, Son, and Satan. Three people walk into a bar, a priest, a nun, and Osama bin Laden. You get the idea. This is why Jesus talks in parables. They never go the way that you expect. For Samaritans, in the eyes of Jesus' people, Jewish people, are scumbags, losers, manipulators. People who have affiliated with the Jews when it was politically expedient to do so, but claim sovereignty, independence, and separation whenever the tea leaves looked like the Jews were going to be in for a hard time. There are plenty of stories of Jews traveling through Samaria and getting beaten and robbed, and a few during the time of the Roman governor Cumanus in the years 48 through 50, where Jews were attacked by a group of Samaritans from a particular village, killing several Jewish people. But Cumanus had been paid off in advance by the Samaritans and did nothing. Jews responded by setting a number of Samaritan villages on fire. This was serious enough to get the Emperor Claudius's attention all the way over in Rome, this little squabble between Jews and Samaritans, because for many periods of their existence, it was much closer to war than just squabbling. They are enemies, Samaritans and Jews. We like this story because it is a story we think about helping somebody in need. In fact, it is a story about loving enemies. People like to dismiss this component of Jesus' sayings and Jesus' ministry, loving your neighbors and also your enemies. As if he didn't really mean that, or he was being hyperbolic. And yet, one of the most famous stories in our tradition is not just about helping your neighbor, but is in fact about loving your enemy. It is also a story about being willing to accept help from enemies. For Jesus, the what is way more important than the who. The what is the mercy. Who did it is not that important to him. The lawyer asks, "Who's my neighbor?" Jesus responds, "Who cares?" So you can update the story now, put it into the 21st century, and hear of a Jew walking through the West Bank on their way out of Jerusalem, and that Jew is beaten and robbed and left half dead. And who might pass by? A rabbi? A Christian missionary? An Israeli soldier? But it is the Palestinian Muslim who stops to help. You can also set the story in Ramallah, change the characters, and get a similar effect. Could this story also be set now in Dallas or Minnesota or Louisiana? Jesus once again points people towards the essential fact that binding wounds is harder, way harder than throwing grenades. Building the bridge is far more difficult than bombing it. These are inconvenient truths. What does it mean to read this parable of love for enemies, the willingness to accept help from enemies this week? Are we at a collective bottom for race relations and gun violence and policing and the kind of derangement on display in Dallas? The difficulty in knowing where the bottom is you don't know where it is until you've escaped it. Ask anybody who has ever suffered with addiction or watched another suffer with addiction, and you know this plainly. At the time that you are going through it, you never really know where bottom is. And so we can't know. We can't possibly know if, as a culture, that we are at bottom right now. Hope will not come to us so cheaply. Hope does not come simply because we think we're at the point where things can only get better from here. And in that vein, I have to make a confession. I confess that in order to try and make my life easier and your lives easier, I went off on a mighty search on Google to try and find a story or two of Jewish and Samaritan cooperation in modern times. I thought if I could just find an example of how these folks have now come to love each other, that could lead to a thesis for us today of collective hope. As if to say, see, America, we can do it too. But Jesus tells us a story from a couple of thousand years ago, but now it has come true in a way today by examples X and Y. And the reality is that I couldn't find any stories like that, which is not the same as saying that they don't exist. I'm sure they must exist. After all this time, they must exist. But I recognize that Google search was done to try and pretty up the picture, to put some sugar on top of the gruel, to make us feel better. That's not how you win hope in your life. Hope isn't found in a quick Google search, as much as folks want to pretend it is. In the same way, it is rarely found on a computer screen at all. It is rarely found on your iPhone. A screen can change your optics. It can change what you see and how you process something. It can even offer a sliver of inspiration sometimes, but it's not where you're going to find hope. Hope is not going to suddenly come to you as you obsess over the news or someone's feed. You can't tweet your way out of hopelessness. Jesus didn't give us a parable so we could just sum it up in a line. Help others. Indeed, the lawyer who asks him the questions that gets this particular ball rolling wants to know what he should do. And Jesus paints a picture of how to be. We discover how to be, how to live in context of relationships and community, and the push and pull of being unable to edit ourselves with our phones and our computers, to delete our words suddenly when you're talking to someone. And when you are talking to someone who you think is a moron, a jackass, a cause of all that ails us, you have a wide array of options available to you. One of which is that person, Jesus seems to be saying, that person may be as Christ to you. Philando Castile could not possibly have been as Christ to the officer who shot him. And the officers who shot Alton Sterling surely did not see the Christ or the divine mystery in him. And Micah Johnson could not or would not see the Christ or the divine spirit in the 5 officers that he murdered and the 7 others that were harmed by his bullets. Indeed, I would argue that it is nigh on impossible to see the Christ, the divine mystery in the other when you have a long gun on your back or in your room or anywhere near you at all. You necessarily have turned the other into an enemy that has no capacity to be Christ for you. Indeed, the arguments that guns are inanimate objects, that it is people who hurt people, not guns who hurt people, has proven to be pure folly. Because guns necessarily animate. They animate us. They make us feel safe and strong or fearful and targeted. When a man stood next to my daughter with a gun on his hip in the public library in Woodland Park, Colorado, the gun mere inches from Josie's ear, you can bet she became animated. You can be sure that my spouse became animated when she became witness to that. Weapons can never be inanimate for what they do to us. And what they do to us is necessarily turn away from each other as we become animated by them. The priest and the Levite behave as humans do so often. The Samaritan and the man left half dead are, in Jesus' view, what God's realm looks like. This is an incredibly difficult story. One that requires us to talk to each other in order to find hope, grounded purpose, and loving change. So as I invited the children earlier, I hope we all will continue the conversation in our fellowship, at lunch, at dinner tables, that we will talk about the parable and the world and your call. Not so much what you'll do, but what you will be and what you are becoming. Except isn't that exactly the problem? That what we think that what we do can be divorced from who we are. Isn't that the problem? That we think that what we do can be divorced from who we are. Jesus seems to know this in the parable. You become a neighbor by what you do, but you don't inherit eternal life. You don't become spiritual. You don't become connected to God. You don't become grounded in the divine mystery. You don't become enlightened by just doing something in one particular moment. Who you are and what you do are constantly in flux, evolving and changing. The two, who you are and what you do, these can not be divorced from each other. Nobody would ever accept that. And so, who are we and what are we doing? I tell what I hope are funny stories about coaching little kids soccer. And what you'll find in this idyllic community of families who are black and white, Hispanic and Asian, with fathers and mothers, watching 7-year-olds run around a field, and their veins are popping out of their temples as they scream and yell at little children to get him, attack, attack, go. We regale each other with our tales of fantasy football teams celebrating the gladiators who line up in the fall as they talk about getting in the trenches and doing battle. All the while they are giving each other permanent injuries while we high-five each other from the safety of the stands or our living rooms. We shout each other down with an aggression that is often deeply disturbing. If only we weren't hidden behind a screen. We'll accuse others of being mentally ill or of committing microaggressions. We'll flex our intellectual or emotional muscles in a way that is nothing but violent and pass it off as vigorous debate. We flip each other off on the parkway and pretend that it's got nothing to do with the rest of our character, and who we really are is not who we are when we drive, and it is exactly who you are, who we have become: thin-skinned, aggressive, violent, scared, racist. If only it were so simple as changing what we do for a brief moment. I can't just think my way around this one. Neither can any of us. For the parable asks a really deep and difficult question. What are the conditions that existed for the Samaritans who have put aside his hatred and who have embarked upon such a radical change in heart that instead of spitting on the man in the ditch, he loved him tenderly? What are the conditions that are needed for you and I and we to love in this way? Peace be with you.